There are moments in government hearings when you realize the problem is not incompetence, not confusion, not even political theater. The problem is something much simpler and much more dangerous. Someone knew the truth and chose to say, "I don't know," anyway. So here is the question that should bother every American watching what happened inside Senate Judiciary Committee Room 226 this morning. What do you call it when the director of the FBI signs a document confirming he received precise information about one of the most sensitive investigations in modern history, and then spends 15 months telling Congress he doesn't have that knowledge? Is that a misunderstanding, or is that a lie? Because what Senator Mazie Hirono did in 67 seconds was not a clever political moment, not a partisan ambush, not a viral clip designed for social media. It was something much colder and far more serious. It was the methodical demolition of a witness's credibility using nothing but his own paperwork. And once you understand exactly what happened in that room, the three words Kash Patel used again and again across congressional hearings begin to sound very different. I don't know. Three words that sound humble. Three words that suggest uncertainty. Three words that allow a witness to glide past uncomfortable questions without technically refusing to answer them. But those same three words become something else entirely when a document exists proving the witness actually did know. So let's slow down and reconstruct the moment carefully, because this was not an ordinary exchange between a senator and a government official. This was a prosecutorial sequence unfolding in real time, and every step of it was deliberate. The setting was the Senate Judiciary Committee hearing room, 11:02 in the morning. Kash Patel had already been sitting at the witness table for more than 2 hours. The rhythm of the hearing had settled into something familiar to anyone who has watched congressional oversight before. Senators ask questions. Witnesses give carefully crafted answers. Lawyers watch closely. Time expires. The next senator begins. And throughout that process, Patel had deployed a phrase that had become his shield. I don't know. In the previous hour alone, he had used it 3 separate times when questions turned toward the scope of the FBI's Epstein investigation files. How many names appeared in those materials? I don't know. Which agents handled certain assignments? I don't know. What briefings had been delivered to his office before key public statements? I don't know. The phrase worked. It always does. Because I don't know is difficult to challenge in the moment. You cannot prove what someone remembers or doesn't remember without documentation. And in most hearings, that documentation never appears. But Mazie Hirono did not arrive at that hearing hoping to improvise. People in both parties will tell you something about Hirono that explains what happened next. She prepares, methodically, obsessively. She reads documents until she knows them line by line. She anticipates every possible response a witness might give and constructs the question so that each of those responses collapses. That is why what she brought into the hearing room that morning mattered so much. One document, not a stack of files, not a binder of exhibits, a single page. At 11:02, her time began. Hirono set the document on the desk in front of her. She did not wave it. She did not announce it dramatically. She placed both hands flat on the paper as if anchoring it in place. Then she spoke. Director Patel, she said calmly, I want to revisit something you told this committee today. Specifically what you said at 9:51 this morning in response to Senator Durbin's question about whether the FBI Director's Office had been briefed on the scope of materials in the Epstein case files before the Department of Justice's public statements in January. Patel looked relaxed. He had already answered that question earlier in the hearing. Senator, he replied, as I stated, I don't have specific knowledge of the full briefing scope at that time. My office receives summaries of significant investigative matters, and the detailed parameters of what was included in any particular briefing would require me to review the relevant records. It was a familiar formulation, polished, careful, non-committal. Hirono nodded once. Then she lifted the document, and for 3 seconds she held it up so every camera in the room could see the FBI letterhead at the top of the page. 3 seconds can be a long time in a congressional hearing. Long enough for the press gallery to lean forward. Long enough for lawyers at the witness table to suddenly stop writing. Long enough for everyone in the room to realize something unexpected is about to happen. Director, Hirono continued, this is an internal FBI executive briefing memorandum dated December 19, 2024. It is addressed to you personally by name as FBI Director Designate and was transmitted to your office during the transition period before your confirmation. Patel's expression began to tighten. Hirono kept reading. The subject line reads, Comprehensive Scope Review, Epstein Investigation Files Materials Assessment. Then she paused. This document, she said, was prepared by the FBI Counterintelligence Division Senior Briefing Team and delivered to your transition office 32 days before you were confirmed as director. That was the moment when Patel's right hand moved slightly toward the edge of the table. A small motion, almost subconscious. The kind of movement people make when their body recognizes a problem before their mind has fully processed it. Hirono looked down at the memo. Let me read you what it says. The room was silent. This memorandum constitutes a comprehensive scope review of all materials currently held by the FBI in connection with the Jeffrey Epstein investigation and associated counterintelligence files. The following summary is provided to the Director Designate in accordance with standard pre-confirmation briefing protocols. She turned the page slightly so the cameras could see. Total document count, 312,847 individual files. A few heads in the press row lifted. Physical evidence items, 1,224. Witness interview recordings, 418. Then came the line that would reshape the entire exchange. Named individuals appearing in materials with more than 3 references, 94 individuals across 12 categories. Hirono did not rush the words. Of those 94, 31 are identified as high-profile individuals defined as holding or having held elected or appointed public office, significant corporate leadership, or foreign government positions. And finally, she read the line at the bottom of the memo. Briefing recipients, Director Designate Kash Patel. Confirmed receipt December 22, 2024. She lowered the document and looked directly at him. Director Patel, she said quietly. At 9:51 this morning, you told Senator Durbin you do not have specific knowledge of the full briefing scope at that time. She tapped the memo. This document shows you received a comprehensive scope review on December 19th and confirmed receipt 3 days later. Then she listed the numbers again. 312,847 files, 1,224 evidence items, 418 witness interviews, 94 named individuals. Her voice never rose. You had specific knowledge of the full briefing scope 32 days before you were confirmed as director. Then she asked the question that turned the hearing room cold. Did you forget that you received this briefing, or did you choose not to mention it when Senator Durbin asked? And that is the moment the room changed. Not the loud silence of shouting or outrage. The quiet kind of silence that settles over a room when a contradiction becomes undeniable. The silence that appears when a witness's previous answers begin to collapse under the weight of a document. Patel's jaw tightened. His hand moved toward his water glass, then stopped halfway. Both of his attorneys leaned forward at the same time. One of them began speaking quickly. Senator, briefing materials received during the transition period are distinct from the formal operational knowledge that guides my responses as director. The document you're referencing is a pre-confirmation summary, and its characterization as constituting knowledge in the context of... Hirono interrupted with a single word. No. Not loud, not angry. Flat. The way a judge says it when a motion is denied. She pointed to the bottom of the page. This document contains the phrase confirmed receipt. That means you did not merely receive this document, you acknowledged it. She looked back at Patel. You read this briefing. You signed for it. Then she repeated his words from earlier in the hearing. And this morning, When Senator Durbin asked whether your office had been briefed on the scope of the Epstein materials, you said you did not have specific knowledge of the full briefing scope. She set the memo on the desk again. That is not a distinction between pre-confirmation and operational knowledge. Then came the line that landed like a verdict. That is a false statement made under oath. Ma'am. And in that moment, the phrase Kash Patel had used 11 times over 15 months of congressional oversight suddenly looked very different. I don't know. Because once a signed briefing memo exists, the question is no longer whether the witness knows. The question becomes why he said he didn't. And once that question appears in a hearing room, everything changes. Because congressional oversight does not collapse when a witness refuses to answer. It collapses when a witness answers in a way that later proves false. There is a difference between evasion and contradiction, and what Mazie Hirono had just placed on the table was not an interpretation dispute or a policy disagreement. It was a document with a date, a subject line, a distribution list, and a signature confirming receipt. So now the hearing was no longer about the Epstein files themselves. It was about something much more dangerous for a witness under oath: credibility. Hirono understood that, which is why she did not rush forward emotionally or attempt to dominate the room. Instead, she slowed the exchange down, the way a prosecutor does when the jury has just heard the piece of evidence that matters most. Her job now was not to argue. Her job was to force the witness to walk through the contradiction himself. Director Patel's attorney was still speaking, trying to construct a legal distinction between transition briefings and operational knowledge. It sounded technical, almost bureaucratic. But Hirono did not respond to the theory. She responded to the facts. She picked up the document again and pointed to a specific line near the bottom. Director Patel, she said, this line states, briefing recipients, Director-designate Kash Patel. Confirmed receipt, December 22nd, 2024. Then she explained the significance of that sentence with the patience of someone who knows every camera in the room is capturing the moment. A confirmation of receipt is not a passive event. It is a deliberate action. It means the document was received, acknowledged, and logged by the recipient. Her tone was not accusatory, it was clinical. You read this briefing. You acknowledged receiving it, and the briefing contains specific numerical details about the scope of the Epstein investigation files held by the FBI. She paused again. And this morning you told Senator Durbin that you did not have specific knowledge of the full briefing scope. That was the moment when Patel tried to pivot. Witnesses often do. When a contradiction appears, they search for a conceptual escape route. In this case, Patel leaned back slightly in his chair and chose language that sounded precise without actually answering the question. Senator, he said, transition briefing materials are provided in a preliminary context and are subsequently superseded by operational assessments developed through the formal intelligence review process that begins upon confirmation. That sentence contained a lot of words, but if you listen closely to what it did not contain, one thing stands out. It did not deny receiving the memo. It did not deny reading the memo. And it did not deny that the memo contained the exact numbers Hirono had just read into the record. Hirono knew that, and instead of arguing about his explanation, she moved the conversation to a simpler point. How many named individuals are in the Epstein files? The interruption was so calm that for a moment the room wasn't sure she had spoken. Patel blinked. Hirono repeated the question. You just heard me read from a briefing delivered to your office that lists 94 named individuals. How many named individuals are currently referenced in the Epstein investigation files held by the FBI? This was a different kind of pressure. It forced Patel into a corner where the answer could no longer hide behind legal theory. If he said he didn't know again, the memo contradicted him. If he confirmed the number, he would implicitly acknowledge the earlier statement had been false. So he chose the third option witnesses often reach for when both doors are closed: classification. Senator, Patel said carefully. I cannot provide a specific count of individuals referenced in classified investigative materials in an open setting. Hirono nodded, but the nod did not signal agreement. It signaled recognition that he had just shifted ground.
That, she said quietly, is a different answer from, I don't know. You could feel the temperature in the room drop another degree, because what she had just done was subtle, but devastating. She had forced Patel to admit, without using those exact words, that he did in fact possess knowledge of the numbers. He simply could not discuss them publicly, which raises a logical question. If the number exists in classified materials and was delivered to his office in a briefing memo, why did he say he didn't have that knowledge when asked previously? Hirono was not finished. She lifted the memo again, but this time she did not read the entire document. She only referenced it as a foundation for something else. Director Patel, she continued, in your testimony on September 17th of last year before the Senate Intelligence Committee, you were asked how many high-profile individuals were named in the Epstein investigation files. She turned slightly as if recalling the moment. Your answer, according to the official transcript, was, I don't have that specific number available. Then she placed the memo back on the desk. The briefing delivered to your office on December 19th, 2024 provides that number. She paused. 31 high-profile individuals. There was a shift in posture among several senators seated along the dais. A few leaned forward. One staff member began whispering urgently into a phone. Hirono continued with the same calm tone. You had that number 9 months before Senator Kennedy asked you the question. Then she leaned slightly closer to the microphone. And you said you didn't. What she was doing now was something every prosecutor understands instinctively. She was stacking evidence, not loudly, not dramatically, just piece after piece until the weight becomes impossible to ignore. First the memo, then the numbers, then the earlier testimony, then the contradiction. Now came the question that mattered most. Director Patel, she said, I am going to ask you directly, and I want a yes or no answer. The room was completely still. When you told the Senate Intelligence Committee in September that you did not have the specific number of high-profile individuals named in the Epstein files, was that statement accurate? 11 seconds passed. It is surprising how long 11 seconds can feel in a congressional hearing. Long enough for the audience to begin counting silently in their heads. Long enough for the witness to look down at his notes, then toward his attorneys. Patel turned slightly toward the lawyer seated closest to him. The attorney wrote something on a legal pad. One word. Then he turned the pad toward Patel so only the witness could see it. The cameras positioned around the room could not capture the word, but they captured Patel reading it, and they captured what happened next. He straightened slightly in his chair. Then he tried to answer. Senator, Patel said slowly, I want to be precise about the distinction between yes or no, Director. Hirono did not raise her voice. She simply removed the escape hatch. Was your September testimony accurate? 14 seconds. This time the silence was even longer. Patel's eyes moved briefly toward the memo sitting on the desk in front of Hirono, then back toward his attorney, then toward the chairman of the committee. Finally, he spoke again. Senator, he said, I would characterize my September response as reflecting the operational knowledge available to me in that context, rather than the full scope of all materials previously reviewed. It sounded careful, technical, almost reasonable. But listen closely to the structure of that sentence. He did not say the testimony was accurate. He did not say the testimony was incorrect. He said something else entirely. That it reflected the operational knowledge available in that context. Hirono stared at him for 3 seconds. Then she turned slightly toward the cameras. And in that moment, the hearing shifted from questioning to something that looked much closer to closing argument. He just told this committee, she said calmly, that his September testimony reflected the operational knowledge available to him in that context. Then she lifted the memo one final time.
What he cannot say, she continued, because it would be admitting perjury, is that the full scope of all materials previously reviewed was delivered to his office on December 19th, 32 days before he was confirmed as director. You could see several senators exchange glances, because the implication was now hanging in the air where everyone could see it. If a witness knowingly provides false information to Congress, the relevant statute is not complicated. Title 18, United States Code, Section 1001. False statements to federal officials. Maximum penalty, 5 years in prison. Hirono gathered the document in her hands. Then she delivered the final procedural step with the same calm tone she had used from the beginning. "I am entering this memorandum into the Congressional record," she said, "and I am formally requesting that the Senate Judiciary Committee transmit the September 17th hearing transcript together with this December 19th briefing memorandum to the Department of Justice Inspector General for evaluation of whether Director Patel's testimony constitutes a knowing false statement." She turned toward Chairman Durbin. "I have no further questions." The gavel came down a few seconds later. Technically, the hearing continued. But something important had already ended. Because once a witness's credibility collapses in front of a document, every previous statement begins to look different. And somewhere in the back of that room, journalists were already opening old transcripts, searching for 3 familiar words. "I don't know." For the next few seconds after Chairman Durbin's gavel fell, the hearing room behaved as if nothing unusual had happened. Another senator began speaking. Staffers shuffled papers. Cameras continued recording. On the surface, the machinery of Congress kept moving exactly as it always does, but anyone who has watched these hearings long enough knows when the center of gravity shifts. Because the questions that followed did not matter nearly as much as the one document now sitting in the Congressional record, and that document had a date on it. December 19th, 2024. It had a subject line: Comprehensive Scope Review, Epstein Investigation Files Materials Assessment, and it had a confirmation line at the bottom. Director-designate Kash Patel, confirmed receipt December 22nd. In other words, it was not a rumor, not a media leak, not an interpretation offered by political opponents. It was an internal FBI briefing memo delivered directly to the incoming director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation before he even took the oath of office. Now ask yourself a simple question. What is the purpose of a transition briefing? When a new director takes over an agency like the FBI, the transition process exists for one reason: so that the incoming leadership understands exactly what they are inheriting. Sensitive investigations, intelligence priorities, counterintelligence risks, ongoing cases with national implications. No one hands a future FBI director a document summarizing 300,000 investigative files as casual reading. Those briefings exist because knowledge matters. Which is why the phrase Kash Patel used across 15 months of oversight hearings suddenly carries a different weight. I don't know. Let's count them. The September Intelligence Committee hearing where Senator Kennedy asked how many high-profile individuals were referenced in the Epstein files. I don't have that specific number available. The Judiciary Committee hearing earlier this year when Senator Durbin asked whether the director's office had been briefed on the scope of materials prior to public statements by the Department of Justice. I don't have specific knowledge of the full briefing scope. Another exchange months earlier when a different senator asked whether Patel had personally reviewed evidence categories associated with the Epstein investigation. I don't know the details of the material distribution. Each time the same pattern appeared: a question about scope, a question about numbers, a question about what information existed inside the FBI's files, and each time the same 3-word shield appeared. I don't know. Now place that pattern next to the document Hirono read into the record. 312,847 files, 1,224 physical evidence items, 418 witness interview recordings, 94 named individuals appearing multiple times across investigative materials, 31 identified as high-profile figures, That level of detail does not exist in vague institutional memory. It exists because someone compiled it deliberately and briefed it to leadership. Which means the contradiction Hirono exposed was not rhetorical. It was numerical. And numbers are unforgiving. If a witness tells Congress he does not know the scope of investigative materials, but a memo exists proving he received a detailed numerical summary months earlier, the question becomes unavoidable. Was the witness mistaken? Or was the witness concealing information he already possessed? Now here is where the story moves beyond the hearing room itself. Because Mazie Hirono did not accuse Kash Patel of lying in a vacuum, she attached that accusation to a federal statute. Title 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. False statements to Congress. The law is straightforward. It does not require dramatic conspiracies or elaborate cover-ups. The elements are simple. A person must knowingly and willfully make a materially false statement to the legislative branch. Knowingly, willfully, materially false. The memo Hirono introduced matters because it addresses the first two elements directly. Knowledge. If Patel confirmed receipt of a briefing memo outlining the scope of the Epstein investigation files, then claiming he lacked knowledge of that scope becomes difficult to reconcile. Willfulness. If the knowledge existed in documented form months before the testimony, the question becomes whether the statement was merely careless or deliberately misleading. Materiality. Congress was not asking idle questions. Senators were attempting to understand the scope of investigative materials tied to one of the most scrutinized criminal networks in modern American history. Which means the answers mattered. This is the moment where many political commentators try to reduce the story to partisan conflict. Republicans versus Democrats. One side attacking the other. A hearing turning into political theater. But that explanation misses the deeper problem entirely. Because oversight is not a performance designed for television. It is one of the few tools Congress possesses to ensure that powerful federal agencies remain accountable to elected representatives. When the director of the FBI testifies under oath, senators are not merely asking questions out of curiosity. They are attempting to determine whether the country's most powerful law enforcement agency is being transparent about investigations with enormous public implications. And the Epstein investigation carries implications that extend far beyond one criminal defendant. The case touched finance, politics, intelligence, international networks of influence, and allegations involving individuals with extraordinary social and institutional power. That is why people keep asking the same questions. How many files exist? How many names appear in those files? Who was referenced repeatedly in investigative materials? Those questions are not gossip. They are attempts to understand whether the system treated every participant equally, which brings us to the moral dimension of what happened in that hearing room. Imagine an ordinary citizen sitting in a courtroom, testifying under oath about documents they signed months earlier. Imagine that person telling the judge they do not know the contents of a report they personally confirmed receiving. What would happen next? The answer is not complicated. The document would be introduced into evidence. The witness would be confronted with their signature, and the credibility of every previous statement they made would immediately come into question. The law does not bend simply because the witness holds a powerful office, or at least it is not supposed to. That is the reason Hirono's exchange carried such force. She did not rely on speculation. She did not rely on leaked information or anonymous sources. She relied on the same standard that applies in every courtroom across the country: a document, a date, a signature confirming receipt, and the witness's own words. I don't know. When you place those elements side by side, the contradiction does not require interpretation. It becomes visible to anyone willing to read the page. Now think about what happened in the hours after that 67-second exchange. The clip began circulating online almost immediately. Journalists posted the memo. Legal analysts began reviewing the statute Hirono referenced. Commentators started asking whether the Inspector General referral would lead to a formal inquiry. But something else began happening quietly at the same time. Reporters started pulling transcripts. Not just the hearing from that morning, but every hearing where Kash Patel had appeared before congressional committees since becoming director. Judiciary Committee, Intelligence Committee, Oversight hearings, budget testimony. And each time they encountered those three words again. I don't know. At first, the list contained only a few examples. Then it grew longer. 9 instances where Patel told senators he lacked specific knowledge about investigative scope, materials, or figures associated with the Epstein files. 9 statements. Across 15 months. Now, here is the critical point. Before Mazie Hirono introduced that memo, each of those answers looked like routine caution from a government official testifying about sensitive matters. After the memo appeared, those same answers began to look like something else. A pattern. And patterns are what investigators pay attention to, because a single inaccurate statement might be a mistake. 2 might be carelessness. But when the same phrase appears again and again in response to questions about information that was already documented in a briefing memo, the explanation becomes harder to accept. That is why the 67 seconds Hirono spent reading that document may end up mattering long after the headlines fade. She did not prove what is inside every Epstein file. She did not expose the names of the 94 individuals referenced in the briefing. What she did prove was simpler. The director of the FBI had been given a detailed scope review of the investigation before taking office, and yet he repeatedly told Congress he lacked knowledge of that scope. That contradiction now exists in the official congressional record, and once something enters the record, it cannot be erased by explanations offered later. The hearing room may have moved on, but the document did not move. It stayed exactly where Hirono placed it, 1 page, 1 memo, and the 3 words that may have just ended a 15-month strategy. I don't know. And here is the part of the story that matters far more than a viral clip or a trending headline. When a contradiction like that enters the congressional record, it does not disappear when the hearing ends. It begins a different process entirely. Because the machinery of oversight moves slowly, but once it starts moving, it follows a path that witnesses cannot control. Mazie Hirono understood that perfectly when she made the final move of her questioning. She did not ask for an apology. She did not ask Patel to clarify his wording. She did not even demand an answer on the spot. Instead, she invoked procedure. She asked that the December 19th FBI briefing memorandum and the transcript of the September 17th Intelligence Committee hearing be transmitted to the Department of Justice Inspector General. That step matters, because once a referral is made, the question is no longer a political argument inside a hearing room. It becomes a matter of investigative review. The Inspector General's office does not operate on viral clips or partisan commentary. It operates on documents, timelines, and testimony. And the timeline in this case is brutally simple. December 19th, 2024. The FBI Counterintelligence Division prepares a comprehensive scope review of the Epstein investigation materials. December 22nd. Director-designate Kash Patel confirms receipt of that briefing. September 17th, 2025. Patel testifies before the Senate Intelligence Committee and states that he does not have the specific number of high-profile individuals referenced in the files. 11 months later, inside Senate Judiciary Committee room 226, Mazie Hirono reads the memo into the record and asks a question that forces those 2 moments to collide. Was that testimony accurate? Now pause and consider what this means outside the narrow boundaries of Washington politics. Because this is where the moral dimension of the story becomes impossible to ignore. The Epstein investigation is not an ordinary criminal case. It involves allegations of exploitation, trafficking, coercion, and a network of powerful individuals who were able to move through elite financial and political circles for years without facing consequences. The victims in that case were not senators or billionaires or government officials. They were young women whose lives were shaped by the decisions of people with extraordinary wealth and influence. And when the public hears that there are hundreds of thousands of investigative files connected to that case, containing interviews, evidence, and references to individuals with political and corporate power, they expect one thing from the institutions responsible for investigating it: honesty. Not perfection, not omniscience, just honesty. When Congress asks the director of the FBI whether he knows the scope of those files, the expectation is not that every detail will be revealed in open session. Classified information exists for a reason. Sensitive investigations require discretion, but discretion is not the same thing as denial. If the director cannot discuss specific numbers because the information is classified, the answer is simple: I cannot discuss that in an open setting. What the answer cannot be, if the document exists, is I don't know. Because those two responses mean very different things. One protects classified information, the other suggests the information does not exist, and that difference is exactly what Mazie Hirono exposed in those 67 seconds. Now imagine the position Kash Patel finds himself in after that exchange. Every previous hearing transcript becomes evidence to review. Every moment where he used those 3 words becomes a data point. Every question about scope, about names, about briefings delivered to the director's office will now be examined next to the memo that proves he had already received a detailed summary. That is why reporters started digging through old transcripts within minutes of the hearing ending. Because oversight does not happen in isolation. It happens across time. One statement leads to another. One document leads to another. And when a pattern appears, investigators begin asking the most uncomfortable question of all. Was the statement made knowingly? If the answer to that question is yes, the legal consequences are clear. False statements to Congress are not symbolic violations. The statute Hirono referenced carries a maximum penalty of 5 years in federal prison. Now, to be clear, an Inspector General referral does not automatically mean criminal charges. Investigations require evidence, interviews, internal communications, and careful legal review. Government officials have defenses available to them, including arguments about interpretation, context, or the meaning of operational knowledge versus preliminary briefing information. But the referral ensures that the question will be examined. And once that examination begins, the story moves beyond the personalities involved. Because the real issue here is not Mazie Hirono or Kash Patel. The real issue is institutional trust. Think about the structure of American government for a moment. Congress writes the laws. Federal agencies enforce them. And oversight hearings exist so that elected representatives can ask whether those agencies are carrying out their responsibilities honestly and transparently. If the answers provided in those hearings are incomplete, misleading, or false, the entire structure begins to wobble. Because oversight without truthful testimony is not oversight at all. It is theater. And the Epstein investigation is precisely the kind of case where theater cannot replace accountability. Too many questions remain unresolved. Too many victims spent years waiting for someone inside the system to take their allegations seriously. That is why the numbers inside that memo matter so much. 312,847 files, 1,224 pieces of physical evidence, 418 recorded witness interviews, 94 individuals referenced repeatedly, 31 of them categorized as high-profile figures. Those numbers represent years of investigative work, interviews conducted, evidence collected, patterns analyzed. They represent the labor of agents, analysts, prosecutors, and victims who came forward with testimony. When the public hears those numbers, they do not hear bureaucratic statistics. They hear the scale of a case that should have been impossible to ignore. And when the director of the FBI appears before Congress and says he does not know the scope of those materials, people reasonably assume that statement is accurate. That assumption is what Hirono challenged, not through speeches, not through accusations, through a document. One page, one signature, One timeline that placed the knowledge inside Patel's office months before he testified otherwise. And here is the uncomfortable truth for anyone watching the hearing. Once a contradiction like that appears, the question no longer belongs only to the Senate Judiciary Committee. It belongs to the public. Did the director of the FBI mislead Congress about information he already possessed? If the answer is yes, what does that say about the transparency of the investigation itself? If the answer is no, what explanation reconciles the memo and the testimony? Those questions cannot be resolved by a 67-second clip circulating online. They require scrutiny, documentation, and a willingness to follow the evidence wherever it leads. That is why the next 48 hours after the hearing mattered so much. Legal analysts began reviewing the statute. Journalists cross-referenced transcripts. Commentators debated whether Patel's answers constituted a technical distinction or a deliberate attempt to avoid revealing what he knew. But beneath all of that noise sits a much simpler reality. The phrase that carried Kash Patel through 15 months of congressional oversight hearings is now permanently attached to a document proving he had already received the information he claimed not to know. I don't know. 3 words that once sounded cautious now sound very different when placed next to a memo that says otherwise. So here is the final question, the one that should stay with you long after the hearing room emptied. If the director of the FBI can sit under oath before the United States Senate and claim ignorance about the scope of one of the most consequential investigations in modern history, even after signing a briefing that described that scope in detail, what does that tell us about the strength of the system designed to hold power accountable? Is oversight still working? Or did Mazie Hirono just expose the moment where it nearly failed? If you believe the truth matters more than political theater, now is the time to pay attention to what happens next. Because this story is not finished. The Inspector General referral has been filed. The documents are now part of the official congressional record, and investigators will have to decide whether those 3 words, repeated 11 times across 15 months, were caution, confusion, or something far more serious. If you think more people need to understand what just happened in those 67 seconds, take a moment to support the channel. Hit the like button so this video reaches more viewers. Share it with someone who follows congressional oversight and federal investigations. Leave a comment telling us what you think the Inspector General should do next. And if you want clear, document-based breakdowns of moments like this, moments where one page of evidence can change an entire narrative, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because sometimes it doesn't take 1,000 documents to expose the truth. Sometimes it only takes one.